I remember very clearly I had just not long delivered Ekaterinburg, and I was on a plane to Austria to visit my daughter who lives there. And I remember somewhere over the continental landmass I was in, and I started thinking, well, what other great deaths are there? I mean, love, tragedy, death, they're fabulous subjects for any historian. And I was sitting there and I remember very clearly suddenly thinking, oh, the death of Albert. That was a hugely significant death. It completely changed the path the monarchy took for the second half of the 19th century. And I suddenly thought, well, yes, we've got books on Albert, we've got books on Victoria, but I don't recall any of them saying an awful lot about his death. Also, this very pat acceptance of typhoid fever. And I thought, that intrigues me. I want to look at that more closely, because that was probably one of the most significant deaths in the history of the monarchy, because of how it affected the Queen. And so as soon as I got back home, I got all my books out and I suddenly saw that there was a big hole. Like you say, there's a big gap, and no one had written about it, not in any detail. Even biographies of Albert said nothing about the funeral, really. They didn't give the details of the funeral, the laying out, the coffin, the service. But the other thing I really wanted to write about was the public response, because as a loose analogy, it was a bit like when Diana died, that there was this enormous outpouring of public grief. The shock was so terrible, it was an equally unexpected death, and no one had written about the response of the English public in the churches across Britain when that happened. And in a way, not even very much had been said about the response in the press, which was extensive. So I did an enormous systematic search of Victorian letters and diaries, not just published ones, but also at the Royal Archives. A lot of members of the royal household had things to say about Albert's death and elsewhere. And I found an extraordinary cross-section of comments about his death, the events leading up to it, and the Queen's reaction. But I think probably the most significant, the most poignant of all, were 2 or 3 letters written by Crown Prince Frederick of Prussia, who was married to Victoria and Albert's eldest daughter, Vicky. Vicky couldn't travel over for her father's funeral from Berlin because she was pregnant. So Fritz came in her place, and he was taken in to see Albert laid out on the bed within a day or two of dying by the Queen. And he sent this incredibly poignant description of that moment home to his wife. But the most stunning detail of all, and this is one that no one knew until I did the research for my book, was that when Albert was placed in his coffin, Victoria had a copy of her portrait with the hair snaking down her breast. It's the most intimate private portrait of her, and it was only shared between them. She had that placed in his hand in the coffin. And to me that says everything about what she was going to miss about Albert, about her relationship with him, the passion, the physicality. And it was heartbreaking. She was only 42. And that sense of loss is so poignant by that one significant gesture.